Now, it's important to remember that the 1800s was the time of rapid change in the United States, and that created a lot of anxiety, but it also created massive change that still has its effects and direction in the 21st century. So I want you to think back. Think of the 1800s and what are some of the major changes that you know of that really changed the direction for the United States? Can you think of something? I bet most of you are thinking of slavery, right? Slavery being a massive thing that was abolished in the 1800s and really led to change African-American communities to be able to then push by the 1900s social reform and civil rights movements that we still see play an active role in the 21st century today. But what about other movements? What about on the West Coast? You got Chicano movements. You got the Latino movements that are happening. You have big infrastructure changes with urban societies across the nation and people being immigrating in from all over the place. And you have Chinese immigration populations, you have Filipino populations, you have the Jewish populations at the end of the century in New York and Boston with Irish, all these people coming in, and the changes that happen dramatically all come down to what happens and changes in the 1800s. We could look at that. We could boil that all down to some of the changes that happen in the religious movements, collectively known as the Second Great Awakening. We've looked at the First Great Awakening. We looked at that with colonial life. We saw changes in the connection between the Atlantic world and Britain and the United States and the American colonies at that time, not even America yet. But we saw that the religious changes there were really geared for the anxieties of the time and colonial life and the changes that were happening around Europe. And in a lot of ways, it's the same thing in the 1800s, but now we're talking about an established United States. And the United States looking westward. We spent a lot of time looking at the frontier and how westward expansion is great for some, but bad for others. And you can understand that in what we've looked at. But part of that is the evangelizing of the West as well. And evangelizing with religious enthusiasm that began in Kentucky and Tennessee regions. And by the 1790s and early 1800s, these religious movements, a lot like apostles in this area, these missionary movements, were looking to religious ideas for individual and cultural changes in society. Okay? This United States, this new United States, this new government allowed for people to play an active role in politics, in the government, and the American experience now of what is good and what is bad, what's the direction to go as an individual, as a society, and what's not. And if you tie that all down to this concept of sin, this concept of what makes a bad society, then they were looking at how to make it better. And so you get these religious movements popping up and these movements tied to education, very closely connected to education, where they're bringing in these new universities, these new colleges, largely organized by volunteers, women, and who are educated and growing the idea of educating women, educating children, creating rights for education of women and children, seeing the destruction of alcohol in communities, therefore creating the temperance movement that by the early 1900s lead to prohibition. That gets its movement, but that starts in the 1800s. And then at the same time, also seeing the destruction and the sin and the problems in a religious mindset with slavery. And that leads to abolition movements. So if you think of abolition movements, temperance movements, education, all that having a huge impact and foundation in this Second Great Awakening. So as people evangelize the frontier, women from society spring up and they're able to create what's known as circuit riders who sought out people in remote locations on the frontier. And these circuit riders came among the common people, which helped to establish rapport in the frontier families and really hoped to convert. And as these people were organizing and converting, they also created, publication things to be able to spread word that way and to spread their movement ideas that way. And you see that with the abolition movement. You see that with the temperance movement. And you see that with all aspects and relations to social reform. Even prior to the Civil War, this new devotion to religion connected to civic engagement led to Christian teachings to show Christian teachings with social problems and social gospel of the late 19th century start to show how converts taught to achieve salvation, but also needed to repent for personal sin and also work for moral perfection in the society. So changes and eradicating society sin. So all in all forms. So you start to see people helping also with reforms in prison and reforms and care for people with mental illnesses. And you start to see a change in them. By the end of the 1800s, you start to see a huge change for people, for the poor, and start to see these houses that spring up to show sort of better conditions and education for people who are poor and bad conditions. And also local churches and work together with the law to create institutions where they could transform political action and anti-slavery advocates again, and also variations of reform to implement their personal and society beliefs into the national level of politics. And that's an important part of the Second Great Awakening. All the social changes of anti-slavery movements, of temperance, of individual rights, of women's rights to vote, education of women, of children. And as you see the Industrial Revolution growing and people being in these horrific conditions in the city with pollution and working horrific hours, 23 hours sometimes, 6-7 days a week, you start to see laws and restrictions and regulations for children as well as for other people, and changes in the conditions, all having its foundation in a lot of this Second Great Awakening and the movements of personal and society salvation of the time period.